Well, hello everyone. I have the pleasure of being joined with Kaveh Shahrooz today, and we're going to have a discussion, a wide-ranging one, on everything to do with Canadian policy with Iran and the structure currently of the what I would like to refer to as the gangster regime of Iran, and the Iranian diaspora, is particularly in Canada. Shahrooz.
Well, it's really good to be with you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Just before we started recording, you were telling me about your love of Iran and Persia and the way you sort of separate the regime from the people and the culture. And I think that's a theme that's really important. And I hope that we can kind of stress that through the conversation. We'll be saying a lot of negative things about Iran, but that's just shorthand for the Iranian regime. I think what you will find is that the Iranian people are, very keen for freedom. They are like any people. I mean, they have positives and negatives, but it's a very vibrant culture and one that I think really needs the support of the international community.
Absolutely, and well said. It's a beautiful intro there. And what do you think of our current policy? It might be a good way to start off of Canadian policies with Iran. What do you think? Are we doing adequately, and what do you think we should have improvements on?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, I think it's difficult to even discern really what Canadian policy with respect to Iran is. It's fairly confusing. The government says certain things and then does other things. So, probably the most important starting point for this discussion is even before the Trudeau government came into power, the Harper government had taken a pretty hard line on Iran, consistent with its worldview. So it had cut off diplomatic relations with Iran on the basis that Iran had actually threatened Canadian staff and diplomats in that country. And then the other side of it being that the embassy staff, the Iranian officials in Canada had been responsible for intimidation of diaspora Iranians and so on. So the relations were cut off, and that became the basis of a lot of disagreement. And I think that when we talk about the fact that Canadian policy is very hard to discern, I watched very closely the campaign that brought Trudeau to power, and I watched him give speeches to the Iranian community. And at certain speeches, he would say, we will stand for human rights, we will do this, we will do that, we will take a hard line, basically arguing for a continuation of the Harper policy. And then at other gatherings where he felt like maybe the audience were perhaps a little bit more friendly towards the Iranian regime, he would talk about restoring diplomatic relations and so on. So he was speaking sort of trying to win favor with both sides. So it immediately you knew this wasn't going to work because he wasn't going to be able to do both things simultaneously. And so Canadian policy since then has been, initially there was an effort to restore diplomatic relations with Iran, but it's an effort that failed for a variety of reasons. People have different theories. I think part of it is that the Iranian regime simply, despite outreach by the Canadians, simply didn't respond. Others have other theories that this is just not an important enough relationship for both countries. And certainly it hasn't been helped by the fact that Iran shot down a plane.
Absolutely,
a Ukraine plane. And I hope we can speak about that to some extent. On January 8th, 2020, when Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian commander, had been killed in Iraq, Iran retaliated or attempted to retaliate, but unable to actually hit any U.S. targets. It supposedly mistakenly, but possibly deliberately shot a Ukraine flight that was flying from Tehran to Kiev that actually had a lot of Canadians and permanent residents on board. And since then, it has done everything in its power to prevent a proper investigation and stop the truth from coming out. And so that has meant that, establishing relations between Canada and Iran seems pretty impossible at the moment.
Right. And, that's a good point to continue off there. With the news media being more pervasive with COVID, we have really put that, it's not even just tossed under the rug. We've really just stopped talking about it completely. It's like it never happened in the psyche, which is so grossly ignorant for us to do, because that is something we need to. If we stand up for our values, for the Charter of Rights, for residents and citizens of Canada, then we as a country need to be behind the Iranian diaspora in Canada, and behind our fellow Canadians, and to stand up to this. It's ridiculous, and I think it's very much a part of their tactics. It's not like it's it's right from the playbook. Dismiss it, call some foul on the government, opposing government, the international community, and try and dismiss it and try and put in blockade. This is very typical of the gangster regime's tactics.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you're right. I mean, there are obviously a lot of issues, COVID being top of the list, that have taken up the government's energy. That's certainly true. But one of the things that I've tried to point out in some of my writing on this and in meetings with government officials is that I think we are mistakenly viewing the story of Iran, and particularly with respect to this plane that I mentioned, as a foreign news story. But it's not a foreign news story. It's a Canadian news story, right? Many dozens of Canadians were killed without explanation. And if our government is not actually standing up for our citizens, stopping them from being killed with impunity abroad, like, what is our government doing? That is really the job one of a government. And so the government, regrettably, has been dragging its feet. It's been saying all the right things to the families, and I help, advise the families legally a little bit. It's been saying all the right things, as saying, we want to fight for you, we want to get justice for you, and so on. But in reality, it's been moving at such a slow pace and allowing Iran to kind of frame the discussion that I think it speaks to a misunderstanding about what Iran is like. We treat Iran like it's a normal country, and it's simply not. I think you're absolutely right. It is a gangster regime. We have to treat them as gangsters.
Right, and you're right in saying that. I think that's a really accurate way of framing it. We have, through news media outlets and the way they've described it, they've really framed it in such a way we have distanced ourselves from it. From that, it's not a Canadian issue. It's within the international community. It just so happens that there were Canadian citizens and residents on board, but we have framed it. I think that's very accurate. Way for you to describe that. We have framed it in such a way where we have distanced ourselves from it, which is so wrong. It's a built-in injustice we're doing to ourselves.
Yeah, worth pointing out, by the way, this is not actually the first time that Iran has killed Canadian citizens. Back in 2002, 2003, I want to say, a Canadian-Iranian photojournalist, Zahra Kazemi, was detained and possibly raped and killed in Iranian prison. An Iranian environmentalist professor. I don't know if he was a citizen, but he was certainly a permanent resident. At least his family lived here. He was taken into custody and died under very mysterious circumstances. A number of Iranian Canadians have been detained for many, many years in Iran, finally released eventually. But Iran is well aware of this, and they seem to target us. And I think that the reason they continue to target Canadians is because our government really doesn't take very strong action.
Absolutely. Even with, recently with, I believe it was the National Post who reported, but I know other Canadian outlets were discussing it, showing that, how everyday Iranians have a hard enough time getting visas to see their family here. But we recently let in someone who was a former, I don't know if he's part of the Revolutionary Guard or a police chief in Tehran.
He was actually both, yeah.
Well, there you go. And it's like, where's the consistency with our presumed values? Where's the consistency here? And especially, why do we take some sort of, I don't even know if it's appeasement or a special approach when it comes to how we deal with Iran? We do ourselves an injustice, very much so.
Yeah, and I think what you point out is really important, and it's worth maybe spending a minute talking about. It is the worst kept secret among certainly among the Iranian diaspora here, but really anybody that's observing things, that Canada has become a safe haven for regime figures. They bring their families here. They engage in terrible abuses of human rights at home, but they themselves don't want to live in that environment, right? So they send their families here. They park their money here. They themselves often have Canadian citizenship. And exactly as you point out, normal Iranians that want nothing to do with this regime have such a difficult time getting into the country. But regime officials seem to come and go as they please. But I should note that this is actually not just a Trudeau problem. I've been very critical of Trudeau in this interview and my other writings, but this problem actually started long before, even under the Harper administration, who had been taking a very tough line on Iran. I think the immigration side of the house had been very keen to bring in Iranian investors. And oftentimes the people that have the money to invest in Canadian businesses and to bring money here are people that have ties to the regime. I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush. There are obviously some people who have made their money in legitimate ways, but there are also a fair number of people who have made money through cronyism, through ties to the regime. And the door was just always open to them, even when our government was talking tough. So it seems to be sort of a bipartisan, tripartisan problem where every party, talks about wanting to stand up for Iranian people, but in
Right.
reality, just opening the door to the repressors.
Absolutely. You make a good point there. I mean, I'm recently this past summer in, I believe it was New York City, with Masha's attempted assassination and kidnapping
Yeah,
through means, people who by all rights had access to passports and access to the U.S. to do so. This was disturbing to me on a very personal level, and I think I know, shocking through the international dysphoria of Iranians that this was even capable for them to make an attempt on somebody's life, attempted
yeah,
kidnapping, but
yeah,
on foreign soil to do so. This was,
yeah.
it's a
I,
very,
yeah.
very disturbing.
Again, maybe for your listeners, your audience that doesn't know the story, Masih Alinejad is just an incredibly outspoken activist. I actually had the good pleasure of just seeing her over the weekend at a conference. She is a force of nature, and she has
Absolutely.
been organizing women to come out and just speak about their experience of life in the apartheid regime they live under. And they send her videos of just everyday interactions with government officials, and how misogyny seems to be sort of embedded in every part
Right.
of life in Iran. And for this so-called crime, the story broke that the FBI had been monitoring this, that there was a plot to actually kidnap her, along with a number of others. Some other names were not released, including Canadians. I don't actually know who those Canadians were, but those names, there were 3 Canadians that were
I
also potential
wasn't, now that I
targets.
wasn't aware of 3
Yeah,
Canadians, I wasn't aware of that.
it did not get the coverage that it needed, but there were 3 Canadians, unidentified, who were part of this plot. And the idea was to kidnap these people and take them back to Iran. Now, the Iranian regime has been doing this increasingly in the past few years, where it has been luring people through deception to countries in and around Iran, like Dubai or Turkey or places like that, and kidnapping them there and taking them back to Iran and hanging them, like giving them so-called trials. They're not really trials, and killing them. And it was going to do this. It's gotten so brazen that it's now beginning to think about doing this, on Canadian soil and on U.S. soil.
Yeah.
And so, unless we take this threat very seriously, and I don't think we're taking it seriously enough, they're going to keep doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't do anything but agree with you on that. And we do. We embed these weird dilemmas for ourselves as if somehow it's a cultural, religious, historical. We embed these things in which it's not that complex. Separate the individuals, the people, the everyday Iranians from the gangster regime, from the theocratic gangster regime. Mas is a personal hero of mine. I think what she's doing is incredible, and I happily say that every Wednesday I wear something white, whether it be a puff, a shirt, something in support of what she's doing. It's amazing. It's amazing to see that in such a short period of time, the outcry, the videos that are being sent, the voices that are being heard, and the pushback. Among the pushback, they still do it, and it's of various ages. It's incredible to see it. Yeah. That kind of leads me into a thought I'd love to talk about more with you. What do you think? There's always talks on both sides of the political aisle, within Canada but abroad, of regime change. Who do you support? How do you support? Do you put in just barricades for trade and goods? Do you think we should place more emphasis on supporting direct support to and alliances with the Iranian diaspora, but also Iranians in Iran saying, yes, we're hearing you. We're not coming to for intervention to invade and to a new regime, because essentially that would just be somebody else doing it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the worst things that the Bush administration did was obviously, the Iraq debacle, but what it did was it just made the concept of regime change, just that phrase itself, and made it such a dirty phrase that we can't even talk about that anymore. I absolutely think that we have to get over that, and regime change, people-led regime change, not through boots on the ground, not through military intervention, but people-led regime change should be the cornerstone of Western policy with respect to Iran. This regime cannot be reformed. It cannot be rehabilitated. It cannot be welcomed into the international community. This is, as you say, it's a gangster regime. They are kleptocrats. They are terrorists. It's just in their DNA. You cannot bargain these things away, because without these elements, this regime just has no identity anymore. Those are core to its identity. Regime change has to be, people-led regime change has to be central to our policy. And what that means is, yes, we have to, first of all, differentiate very clearly between government and people. We have to identify the people inside the country, first and foremost, inside the country. This cannot happen by diaspora alone, right? Diaspora shouldn't be in the business of leading movements. Like, this is really a fight for Iranian people themselves inside the country. But they have important links, and there are a lot of people that were in Iran that were fighting, but just the situation was unsafe for them, so they had to escape. So they become important links to the people inside the country. So we have to talk to them, figure out, what steps can we take, what measures can we put in place that actually helps destabilize the regime, but gives people the tools to overthrow them. We have some. This is again one of my frustrations with the Trudeau government. Trudeau and his government and the whole House voted to list Iran's Revolutionary Guards, for example, as a terrorist entity, not allow them to. They adopted a motion that they were going to do this, and this was 2 years ago. This was before the Revolutionary Guards shot down a plane that we just spoke about, killing a number of Canadians. And yet, to this day, the government of Justin Trudeau has taken no action on this. Right? This is an easy step that we can take to help, again, destabilize Iran's regime. So, if we're serious about that, and I think we ought to be, there's lots of things that we can do, again, in coordination with people inside the country and some of the leaders that are outside.
No, exactly, and it would be a very easy move on our part, and a very significant one to showcase on the global stage of where we stand, but also I think would also perhaps get other G6 nations, G7 nations in line too, and say, hey, this is the stance. If this is where Canada is going as a middle power, then this is where we should be going as other dominant global powers with how we treat Iran and how we look at what they're doing. I mean, you're right. The veil. I like to ironically say the veil of theocracy. They like to wear it, but in fundamentally, it's a gangster regime with chaotic rule base. Whatever the moment, whatever the feel of the moment seems to be the rule of the moment.
Yeah.
And if we value, the individual rights, women's rights, human rights, as Canadians specifically, then how can we not stand up for these values? How do we have how can we permit the idea of gender segregation to be a norm and accepted? It mind boggles me that we allow this. And you're right. It's not just, it's perhaps more pervasive in the Trudeau government, but it's not new to Trudeau government at all.
Yeah. Let me give you another example. Just over the weekend, I was in Washington, D.C. for a conference, as I just mentioned, and I had dinner with friends of mine, husband and wife, both adherents of the Baha'i faith. Baha'is, again, for your audience that may not know, they are a small religious group founded in Iran, now sort of all over the place, but incredibly persecuted in Iran. And so the story of this couple was unbelievable, where the husband's father at the beginning of the revolution, I mean, he had been trained in the United States as a physician. He'd come back to serve the country. But by virtue of the fact that he was Baha'i, he was disappeared in 1980. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened to him. I mean, the assumption is that he was executed, but nobody knows for sure. The family couldn't get jobs, couldn't do anything really. And the wife of the family, the wife of this couple that I'm just speaking about, she had suffered all sorts of discrimination. And she was telling me about the sort of the underground Baha'i university that operates in Iran.
Oh,
right?
Wow.
Because universities will not, for the most part, accept Baha'is as students. And even if they do, they the Iranian foreign minister was always out there saying, no, this is not true. But this actually very much is true. Baha'is are prevented from seeking education, so they have to set up an underground university that the authorities don't know about. And once they get their degrees, they simply can't enter the workforce. So many doors are closed to them. This is apartheid. There is no other way there's no other word to use to explain how you treat an entire population like non-people, preventing them from getting education, preventing them from getting jobs, preventing them from buying houses. When we had the apartheid regime in South Africa, it took us a long time, but we eventually figured out how we ought to deal with them, which is to, completely delegitimize it in every way, and support the people that are fighting against it and celebrate its downfall. I don't know why we're not doing that with an apartheid regime that's operating under our nose.
I completely agree with you on this. I completely agree with you, Kaveh, on this one. And, you make a really good point there. I'm thinking of a comparison which I often like to pose to friends and colleagues is, we always listen to the dissenters throughout history, through during the communist years, during the Cold War. We didn't listen to any official reports. We listened to the dissenters. Why are we not doing that now?
Good question. I think partly our expert class, our key institutions have a certain ideological bent that I think is a problem. Their ideological position is always to see Iran and its regime as the victim of Western imperialism, rather than to kind of judge the government on its own merits and see how horrendous it is. The other is, I think the Iranian regime has probably learned from the mistakes of the Soviet Union and others, and it's learned to sort of bifurcate its message. Right? There's what it does at home, which is horrendous, and then there's the messaging that it has abroad. Up until very recently, Iran's foreign minister was a rather suave, well-spoken man named Javad Zarif, who would travel around the world, smiling and meeting with government officials and meeting with civil society and talking about how Iran is grossly misunderstood. And this is the language that was actually very appealing. And what that wing of the Iranian government, what it has also done, and this is something that I spend a fair bit of time on, is it has established or helped establish a network of apologists in the West. It's a group that I call the Iran Lobby. They operate in think tanks, they operate in academia and media. And what they do is they sell this message of Iran being a misunderstood country, where there are sort of reformists that are kind of working within the government and they're trying to fix things. And only if we normalize relations with Iran, the reformists would win and everything would be good. Right? That is a false story, but it's a story that sounds very appealing. And I think it works well with the ideological assumptions that I mentioned that a lot of people.
You're right. And I've been, I myself have experienced it. I've been exposed to it, where I've encountered individuals who I otherwise thought I agreed with on many topics, and this topic came up, and they reframed all the women, all the men, all the youth, for that matter, who stand up to the mullahs all the time and the gangster regime and the pleas and the positions taken by Iranians in Iran as propaganda. Yeah. And I remember, I intellectually stepped back from this position, from this person who I otherwise respect in many ways. I still do, but I thought, wow, what am I hearing here? I mean, it made me reassess: am I inaccurate on this? Am I getting something wrong? And then I thought to myself, no, this person has an intention of their own right now in this. So it is, and I think it's so subtle that if you're not really in tune to it for yourself, you can get duped into this lobby. I think you're accurate in calling it that. It is a very powerful lobby that where some of us are just so duped into following, and the arguments they pose. I think what's to me, what I find very skillful about it, you gotta acknowledge the skills of this, is similar to China, is they use these, they weaponize our own at fault issues against us. In a very, very, very skillful way. I mean, it has to be acknowledged when they do it. They will turn our own shortcomings against us and use them in certain ways. And it's very like, using pleas of, say, human rights abuses against us in reference to something, or using, for example, one I remember I often used to like this one was how did they phrase it? It was that Western powers or Western governments discussing or criticizing Iran was a form of racial superiority or white supremacy. I thought that's a good way to use a dilemma we're dealing with. And it's very skillful.
True. Yeah. Now, what's interesting, I mean, this strategy is not new, right? Like, if you look at the Soviet Union, they would always go on and on about how the United States was awful and the treatment of African Americans was awful. The treatment of African Americans was awful, but I don't think the human rights situation in the United States at all resembled kind of the horrors of the Soviet Union. They would make these criticisms, but by and large, except with some communist sympathizers in the United States, people didn't buy into it, right? People dismissed it. They could see that this was morally noxious, what the Soviets were saying. The difference now, I think, is that lots more people are actually listening to and believing this nonsense, right? So you have the Iranian regime, anytime you point out to them, like, these are the horrors of your country. They turn around and they talk about, the treatment of how the police here behaves. They talk about the, First Nations people in Canada, and all these things are legitimate problems, but we have a vibrant democratic system that tries to deal with these problems through a democratic framework. Iran doesn't have that. There is no moral equivalence between these two things. Unfortunately, and this is, again, I think the role that the Iran lobby plays, is they tend to kind of validate these arguments from Iran. So if you observe some of these folks from the Iran lobby, as I do a lot, maybe 5% of the time they will talk about problems in Iran, and the rest of the time is devoted to talking about all the horrors of living in the United States. And a lot of them live in the United States. Like they they have all the benefits of living in the West, but they spend all their time criticizing life in the United States. And that's a way of just kind of creating this moral equivalence between these societies where there is no equivalence in reality.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think for my listeners who are just unaware of what we're referring to when we talk about these individuals, these groups made up of many groups and many individuals, in very much areas of within Canada and otherwise of the Iran lobby, is they're men, women, and they're very influential. They're very influential in their connections they have, who they know, and you can be very duped into thinking that what they're saying is coming from the heart, and they're very honest about this. I mean, it comes across very easy, and in many ways, the arguments that are put forth, and it's scary too, because you would think that especially the 21st century, that it would be a lot of, say, Western youth that would be, this would be a cause they would be for, especially the former, as I like to call it, the new left. I don't even know what the heck's going on now. These would be causes, freedom, justice, inequality. These would be causes that rightfully, historically, should be of the left. And as Masha points out too, even too many, as Yasmin Mohammed points out too, it's too often it's those on the left who are disavowing. You might say I like to refer to them as the illiberals, the illiberality, are disavowing. I like to say accurately, our brothers and sisters in Iran. They're disavowing them and their legitimacy of their plea.
Yeah. So remove the name Iran, and remove the concept of the fact that the regime in Iran is a theocratic one, an Islamic theocracy. And just if you speak in the abstract, there's a government out there that treats women as second-class citizens, that has a religious minority that it denies all rights to, that crushes any sort of labor protest, that disappears its opponents, engages in torture, engages in crimes against humanity, all these things, right? If you were to explain this, like everything the left says, this hypothetical regime violates. Everything the left stands for, this hypothetical regime violates. So the left should be really committed to the overthrow of this regime and giving people back their rights. And yet when you call it Iran, and when you say this is an Islamic government, suddenly somehow the discourse changes and the moral calculation changes for the liberal left. And identity politics kicks in, and it just becomes this really weird situation where somehow speaking about this becomes verboten, it becomes this right-wing cause. And I think you're exactly right. So again, your listeners may not know this. One of the things that Masih Alinejad has launched, I think in coordination with some other people, is a campaign called Let Us Talk.
Yes. Right? Beautiful campaign, yes.
Beautiful campaign. It's these Iranian women coming out, especially women, but also some men, coming out and saying, like, this is what happened to me. My pointing out that I am oppressed, that I am, that my life has been taken from me in a lot of ways, that I'm suffocating. This is not Islamophobic. This is just me. Just let me talk. Let me tell my story.
Right.
Storytelling seems to be very central to identity politics. Yet when it comes to this, anytime somebody tries to talk, they're just dismissed as Islamophobic. Right.
And you've unbundled a lot of things there, a lot of really, really good points that I think we should talk about. And I don't mean just us, but we as a society talk about the fact that the criticization of the regime of Iran has nothing, just because they happen to be a theocratic regime, has nothing to do with Islamophobia. It has to do with criticizing the negation of the rights of the citizens and treating them as, subjects still in every sense, theocratic subjects.
It's not just Iran. You will have noticed in recent months that criticisms of China's government are now being lumped in with sort of anti-Asian hate. Because dictators are recognizing the cleavages that exist in our society, these debates that are polarizing us, and they're taking advantage of it, and they're sort of using our own rhetoric against us.
Absolutely. What do you think what do you think are some possible pathways out of this rut of this dialogue, where we could actually separate, which I think, individuals like us, we are, and certainly the diaspora, and of course Iranians in Iran, separate the idea of faith and theology within politics, and separate the idea of criticization of Iran with some form of Islamophobia. These things do not have any connection.
Yeah, I don't know if I have the answer to that question. I mean, if I had it, I would be putting it first. I think it's
right, yeah,
it's a larger
right.
social problem. It's not limited to Iran, right? It's just
Yeah,
like
of course.
the West is fragmenting and it's polarizing in a way that's really hard to put back together. I mean, part of it, I think, is just emphasizing and educating people about what is actually happening inside the country.
Right,
That
right.
this is not about Islam. Also emphasizing to people that like the culture that the Iranian regime is imposing on Iran is not somehow a native culture, right? Like, we're not trying to go in there and impose Western values on Iranian women. Iranian women themselves want freedom. They don't want to live under these conditions.
Right.
And I think that's something that's kind of missed somehow in the Western mind. Demands for freedom and equality are Western demands. They are not. Iranians have been fighting for this for at least 40 years, and much, much longer. Iranian women have been fighting for equality. And I think once we get that through people's heads, maybe they will begin to understand that we're all on the same side here. That we should be allies.
Absolutely, and you're right. There should be kind of some incentive, perhaps, or at least an endeavor on an individual's part to want to try to understand, pre-regime history, and the understand, right back to antiquities, to really understand that all this, from not just the wearing of the chador somehow had to do with Iranian culture. This is nothing to do with that. Yeah, going back, understand where they're coming from, and listen to the voices. I think that's why this is a beautiful campaign by Masha, is let us speak. Let these individual women tell their stories, and let them know what they want, not what they want us imposing on them.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny because what motivates so much of the identity politics left these days is anti-racism, and that's a great thing. I mean, we should all be anti-racist. But once you actually dig in a little bit and look at this a little bit more closely, I mean, there is really this fairly racist thought embedded in the leftist position that somehow freedom, equality for women, for LGBT people, whatever. These are all Western things. The Westerners should be able to enjoy it, but somehow people in Iran, people in Afghanistan, elsewhere, they're somehow now ready for it. Any demand on their part for this is Western imperialism. I mean, that's
yeah.
it somehow treats
in
us
some
as
form,
less man. Yeah.
Right, and in some form that is what we've been hearing for too long. It's what we're hearing, which again, it diminishes the legitimate position we need. And it completely disavows the pleas and the injustices that are being committed right before our eyes. We're in an era now where we see it. It's not like we're just listening by the radio. We have access to this information. We see this, what's going on, and yet we willingly frame it in such a way and believe the framing when it's put in such a way that somehow it has nothing to do with us. It's only a Western thing because the way we're looking at it through our Western eyes. And no, these are our brothers and sisters, our fellow human beings. Who would want to be treated like this? That's how we should. It should be a self-referential question. Why would I want to be treated like this? No one should. No one would want to be treated like this. And yet we take it for a complete disavowing of our own values, and a disavowing of the pleas of those individuals on the ground.
Yeah. I totally agree. I couldn't have said it better.
Yeah, I'm certainly. One thing I think needs to be done more is a great deal of education, a great deal of understanding what's going on. And like we've said multiple times, is a separation with the criticism from faith and and to keep it towards a theocratic regime. This gangster regime is what it is. And realize that it's not something that's self-imposed. The percentages, every time I look at them, it's overwhelming. The amount of who want a regime change, who want it to happen. And as Masha, and I know you have pointed out too, it's the selection, not the election, that goes on.
Yeah.
And so we have to be aware. Nothing is democratic. Nothing is. There's no liberal democracy going on there. It's nothing that we take for value.
One of the lies we're often told about Iran is that Iran is a semi-democracy because its government has certain democratic charades that it puts on to fool the West. First of all, real power is not with the so-called democratic portions of the regime. It's the unelected parts that actually make the really important decisions. And secondly, the elections are so tightly controlled that even people that are loyal to the regime are often not allowed to participate in these elections, right? And so any claim about the legitimacy of this regime is absolutely ridiculous. And the people that make it are trying to fool you, right? The easiest way to assess how popular this regime is to actually hold a free election, but they won't do it.
Yeah.
And the reason they don't do it is because they know they will lose, because they are not popular. They're immensely unpopular, and every piece of data that comes out of that country attests to the fact that it's an incredibly unpopular regime.
Absolutely. And one thing I think I'd love to hear you would express it in a far more a far better way than I think I could. But for my listeners who I think most people in the West largely know of just broadly when they say the Iranian Revolution, but they don't realize there was also a cultural revolution. There was two revolutions. What mechanisms? I guess I would be the best way to put. What mechanisms were at play to have it kind of taken over? Just taking over of first the monarchy, but then to have it taken over by the mullah, taken over by the religious class. What mechanisms just had happened? Because when you look at it, it kind of seemingly happened so quickly.
Yeah.
So the revolution was really taken from the people.
Yeah. So one important thing to note is that around the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1978, 79, the Iranian left made a historic mistake. And I don't think it was accidental that they made this mistake. I mean, they were left, but they were not liberal left. Right. They were very sort of committed still to these old revolutionary, almost Soviet ideas about what a country ought to look like. And so as part of that, they made common cause with the seminaries, basically, that were far better organized. The religious groups in Iran were far better organized. They had not been crushed to the extent that the left had been. So the leftists made common cause with the clerics and thinking that they were going to, over time, overthrow the Shah and take power. They were going to push the clerics aside and make Iran into some sort of leftist country. Of course, they got outplayed. The clerics ended up pushing them out, arresting a lot of them, killing a lot of them. And then you're exactly right. Within a year or two, what happened was a cultural revolution. And the Iranian regime wasn't shy about it. They called it the Cultural Revolution. And the space for discussion narrowed immensely, right? Suddenly, if you were a professor that was teaching things that the government didn't like, you were out of a job. If you were a student whose family had certain connections to leftist groups or to monarchist groups or whatever, you were no longer permitted to attend school. Books were purged. Libraries were closed. Basically all cultural products were suddenly very, very controlled. And I don't mean to overstate what's happening in the West, but we're beginning to see hints of that happening in Western academia and Western cultural spaces, where suddenly there are certain ideas that just cannot be discussed rationally.
No, right? I don't think you're. I don't mean to cut you off there. I don't think you're sounding barricade for no reason or sounding loud. I think it's quite accurate. I think we're seeing little droplets of the water now.
Exactly, but I mean, what's the way it's happening in the West is through economic pressure, and tech companies are censoring certain voices and so on and so forth. In Iran, this happened very, very quickly in the span of a year or two at the barrel of a gun. Right. So imagine all the cultural forces that are playing out in the West right now happening incredibly quickly. University departments being purged, students being purged, books being burned, all of it at gunpoint. Right. And that's the way it played out. And for 40 years now, Iranians have been kind of pushing back against this, but it's very hard when the flow of information is so limited. And I think the introduction of satellite television, and the introduction of the internet in the past decade or so has revolutionized things. Because suddenly Iranians have access to the world in a way that they didn't have for 30 years after the revolution. Some of the effects of that cultural revolution is now being undone, thankfully, because Iranians are much more connected.
Oh yeah, I mean, and that's a good point there, Kaveh. That's a really good point, because one thing I often say is one of the things that often inspires me when someone asks is not necessarily an author or a book, although there are many, is my brothers and sisters in Iran who are of my generation who just say, piss on this. You know what? We're not taking it anymore. So what? You want to, and that, kind of courage and bravery. Most people think it's courageous just to get up in the morning. It's courageous just to walk out the door in Iran for most of them. That is amazing to me. That's amazing because it's not like it's just a slap on the wrist or you're going to go, somebody's going to yell at you. No, somebody either might kill you, beat you, or throw you in the barracks for years and just forget about you. So
absolutely. I mean, some people are responding, and this is a really tragic part of the story, is that the people that have the means or that have the education that can get scholarships, they all leave. So there's this incredible brain drain, right? Just a few days ago, I was talking to a friend who's a graduate of Sharif University, which is Iran's sort of MIT, basically, and he was mentioning, like, in my graduating class, virtually everybody's out of the country, like everybody's left.
Yeah.
Right. And the people that do stay behind, as you say, because they can't get out for whatever reason. I mean, it takes real courage. You have to deal with this regime day in and day out. And that's the thing about theocracies, about sort of totalitarian regimes of this nature, is they're not satisfied to just control the politics. They want to insert themselves into your everyday life. So every normal interaction that you and I would think of as just something free from politics and the government is actually tightly controlled or attempted to be controlled by the regime. So every action is a constant act of resistance against the regime. So I'm in awe of their courage, and I wish them well. And I think it's a moral duty for all of us to stand in solidarity with them.
Absolutely. And, they have my eternal solidarity. The men and women of Iran, the one who are sticking up, just to the mullah class, to the theocracy, just to conduct themselves the way they choose fit. And I, in both in their person, in their style of garb of dress, and even in their sexual preference, that these are all things that we take for granted. Things that these are presumptive values that we have. And I say presumptively because, as we're saying at the top of this podcast, if we hold them dear, and when you have other people pleading that yes, we hold these dear too as well, and we toss it aside as no, these are Western values and somehow they don't apply to Iran and you. We need to really reassess what our values are then.
Brilliantly said. Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah.
Well, you know what? I would love to continue on this conversation with you at another time, maybe a part 2, a follow up on some more details, because I think this is a rich topic and a topic that I think needs more addressing. And I would be honored to have you on as a guest again.
I would love to do that. And I really just appreciate the fact that you care about these issues, that you follow them so closely, and that you're expressing your solidarity. I think that really does mean the world to me. And I'm sure it means the world to the people inside the country that are struggling.
Thank you very much. I do so loudly and proudly, and I say happily. It's much as personal as I think humanistic solidarity for me.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Absolute pleasure.